So let's take a look at how we can use Decimation Master to create 3D objects that can be 3D printed to make physical objects of what we've made in Zbrush. We're going to begin by using this troll here. Now this is 5 subdivision levels. He has 2 million polygons and poly painting. Now while it is possible to 3D print poly paint, oftentimes we just don't do it, but it is possible to retain your poly paint when you do your decimation. Now, what is decimation? Decimation takes a mesh such as this, which is millions of polygons, millions of little squares, and it tessellates it. Now, if you watch the video on Sculptor's Pro Mode, you'll understand that tessellation is the triangulation of the mesh. Decimation Master looks for areas of extremely high detail, and it makes smaller triangles in that area. Then it looks for areas of low detail and makes bigger triangles. Now what that means is we no longer have subdivision levels, but we have a mesh that maintains the look of being very highly detailed, but does not have as much geometry. So it effectively makes the model more efficient and easier to 3D print. So let's take a look at how we'll do this. We'll go to Z Plugin, tear this menu off on the side of the screen, and open up Decimation Master. Now the first thing we need to do is pre-process our mesh. So we're going to click Pre-Process Current. You can pre-process all, which will do every subtool, but I prefer to independently decimate each subtool so I can make sure that they come out at the level I want them to. So I'm going to click Pre-Process Current while I'm selecting the head. It will analyze the mesh, and then what it'll do is it will create a cache file on disk. You'll see it writing out here a cache file. Now, if as you're working with Decimation Master, if it starts to behave strangely, if the decimation doesn't work, or it does some unusual behaviors, then what you'll want to do is come down here and click Delete Caches, because after you've made a few caches, sometimes they can get corrupted. Not often, but if your Decimation Master starts to behave strangely, delete your caches and then redo your pre-process. So now we have pre-processed the mesh. It is reordering. And now it's writing that cache file to disk. There we go. Now it is complete. Now we're able to go in here and actually set our decimation. Now I have the ability to keep my UVs or use and keep polypaint. And polypaint weight will determine how much of the polypaint is actually impacting the decimation process. Now you need to have this turned on before you do your decimation for it to work. So for example here, if I set my decimation level to 800,000 polygons, I use this slider here, 800,000 polygons. If I click Decimate Current, there you go. You see that it decimates, but it does not retain that polypaint. So if I undo that, and then pre-process again, but this time have use and keep polypaint turned on, you'll see what happens is we're able to actually maintain our polypaint. There we go. Now we have pre-processed it with polypaint turned on. So now if I come down here and set my thousands of polygons to 800, this is the slider that I always use for decimation. I don't use percentages and I don't use thousands of points. I use thousands of polys. This is set in thousands, so 800 is 800,000 polys. I click Decimate Current, and because we set it to use and keep polypaint, it maintains the color. If we go into frame mode, you can see what it's done is it has triangulated the mesh. Areas with high detail get smaller triangles, but if we look at the back of the head, we get much larger triangles because there's not as much detail back here. That is the crux of decimation. It basically triangulates the mesh and then reduces triangles in areas that don't have detail and keeps them in areas that do. So now we've reduced this down to a much lower polygon count. It is much easier for us to 3D print this. So I'm going to do a little bit of adjustments to this now and clean it up and make it a nice 3D printable base, 3D printable object with a base. I want to slice off the torso and make it more like a bust, so I'm going to go to the Clip Curve brushes, click OK, turn on X Symmetry, and let's just go ahead and actually what we'll do before we do that, let's go to the trim curve. Now what trim curve actually does is it slices the geometry off physically. So I'm going to turn off my X symmetry, and I'm just going to make some big slices here. I want to get rid of the bottom part here. I want to get rid of this part here and get rid of this part here. There we go. Now it's going to be easier for me to use the clip curve. So I'll go to my clip curve, turn on my X symmetry, and now I'm going to create a nice clipping plane right through here. And that should mirror very nicely and give us a very pleasant looking bust. Now, I'm going to do a rotation. I'm going to turn on the pizza boxes, so I rotate all of my subtools, and I just want to adjust the position of the character in space. And I also want to do a little slice down the back here, so we don't have so much thickness here. So what I'll do is I'll do my, my trim brush again. Let's do trim curve. Control Shift click and drag, and I'm just going to create a nice swoop right up through here, just so it's a little bit more graceful. We should slice that off, and now it's a much more graceful appearance. Now if I go into frame mode, you can see I've got a nice polygroup for this area here. I can Control Shift click on that to isolate it. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to fill this area with at least a variation of the base color if I'm going to be printing this with color. Like I said, some 3D printers will actually print in color. So I'll just go to my standard brush. We don't need to use an alpha, and we'll leave it on the dot stroke. Make sure we're on RGB. And now I can very, very easily use this polygroup just to isolate that area and then fill that with color. And then I'm just going to do the same thing for the sides here. I just don't want that overspray. It looks a bit strange. So we just want to clean that up a little bit. Bring that color right up to the edge. I'm going to turn my RGB intensity down so it feathers it out a little bit. And then we'll run it right up to the edge. And of course we want to do it on the base as well. Now most of the time we're not printing in color. It's not very many printers that print in color, and there's not a lot of demand to print in color, to be honest. Usually these things are printed on gray resin and then painted by hand. But I did want to illustrate for you how you could maintain your color. So now the bust, the head itself, has been decimated. If we go to the eyes, here we have the eyes, and those are only 50,000 polygons, and the teeth, those are 245. So let's go ahead and decimate these. I'll select the eyes, and once again, we'll keep our poly paint, and we need to pre-process current. So I'll pre-process the eyes. That is complete. So let's see, these are set to 50,000. So let's set this to, set it to 0.5, decimate current. That's too low. Let's set that to 2. Decimate current. Still just a little too low. Let's set it to 4. Decimate current. And that's good, especially if you consider the scale that this will be printed at. If we zoom right in, we might see faceting there, but if this is only going to be printed at about this size on what you see on screen, then those facets are not going to be apparent on the eyes. We'll switch to the teeth now, and we'll do the same. Let's turn visibility back on the eyes, and again, we pre-process current for the teeth. And let's set this to 4,000. Decimate current. And there we go. We have a nice decimation on those teeth. We get the detail. Oh, actually, no, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to set this to 7. Decimate current. That's better. So now we've got all of our subtools decimated. Now I'd like to add a base on here. I'm going to append a poly star. We'll select that poly star, and then let's just move this, turn off our pizza boxes, move this down, and then let's turn this into a cylinder 3D. Let's scale this up. I'm going to go to Deformation, Unify. There he is, right up there. That's the problem. My pivot is down here, but the object is up there. So let's unlock it, go to the Unmask Center, lock it again, and then bring it down. There we go. Thought something was amiss. Hold down the Shift key and I'll snap rotate that 90 degrees, scale it down, and then scale it up a little bit so we have a nice little base here. And I'll scooch it back a little bit so it offsets the weight at the back and it doesn't take up too much real estate at the front. If we go into frame mode, you can see that it's all one polygroup. So I will go to the polygroup menu and click Group by Normals, and that'll give me a different polygroup for each normal. Now I can go to Geometry, Crease, and then Control, click and drag Bevel Width, and I can get a nice little bevel on the edges of that, just like so. Now I'm going to go to B for Brush, Z for Z Modeler, click OK. And then what I'll do is I'm just going to zoom in here. And if you haven't seen the Z Modeler video yet, I encourage you to go watch it. If I click and drag, I can insert edges here just to sharpen these edges when I add a subdivision level. So I want to keep these bevels quite sharp. So I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to Control D and add subdivision levels, and you see it keeps that nice bevel there. All right. Let's go ahead and fill this with a nice color. So I'll do RGB, color, fill object. There we go. So now my object is ready to be 3D printed. Well, not quite. We need to set a scale, and we need to export it in a file format that can be opened by the print bureau, or you can upload to a website that does 3D printing like shapeways.com, for example. So what we want to do is we want to export this as either an OBJ or we want to export it as an STL. Typically STL files seem to be the most common. It's sort of a standard file format for manufacturing, whereas OBJ is a standard file format in visual effects and games. So how do we do that? We go back to our plugin menu and go to 3D Print Exporter, or 3D Print Hub, I should say. Now here we can import an STL file. We can set our size and we can export. So first I want to set our size. So we can do this in inches or in millimeters. Let's say I want this to be 6 inches tall. We click that. So this means that the object, when it's exported, will export 6 inches tall. If we come down here to size options, we can do this for all subtools. So everything will actually scale to that scale, keeping its ratio. So let's go ahead and export to STL. So I've got export options down here. I'm going to export all, and I don't want to export separate files, so I'm going to turn that off. If I do that, it'll export a separate file for each subtool. I just want them all together. All right, now I can set it to binary or ASCII, just like an OBJ file, just like a Maya file. They can be either ASCII or binary. Binary is a bit smaller. ASCII is larger and human readable. That's really the only difference. Usually I just use binary. So I'm going to go ahead and click Export to STL, and we're going to go ahead and save this, and we'll call it Troll for print. Now that exports everyone at the selected scale. Now I want to check and make sure that that is exported correctly. So I'll go to a polymesh star and I'll come back here and I'll click import STL file, and I'll import that same file. So that's the STL that I just exported, and there we go. Now you'll notice this did not maintain the RGB values. So what I need to do is go back over here, and under my export settings I'm going to turn on textures. And I'm going to export again, export to STL. Save. And then let it finish. Let's go back to our polymesh star. We'll go to our import options, turn off skip color, and then import STL. And there we go. We bring it in with the color. So this ensures that everything is exported correctly. It's all decimated nicely, and it's a single object, and it's watertight. So this will be 3D printable. I can take this STL and go to a 3D print bureau and ask them to print it, or I can go to a website where I can upload this STL and in real time see the pricing. Shapeways does that. I use them a lot. I can upload an object and it'll give me the pricing for different materials and tell me if there's any potential problems with the mesh. Which brings me to the other mention. If you have not yet, watch the video that I have recorded on polypaint from thickness and draft angles, because that is very, very helpful when you're doing 3D printing, because it will allow you to see areas that might be too thin that may cause a problem with your 3D printing at whatever scale you happen to be printing at. So that is a new tool within ZBrush 2020, and I recommend that you go check that video out now. So that is 3D printing and decimation. I hope you found this video useful, and you can go forward now and start preparing your own models for 3D print, because there's nothing quite like holding an object in your hand that you created in 3D. I make a lot of jewelry and fine art myself using ZBrush, and it's so amazing after years and years of working in materials that don't have a degree of permanence. Digital isn't permanent. Foam latex and resins, those aren't necessarily permanent, but seeing your object in metal or bronze, that's really special. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next.